Hi, it's Mark Lightcap. I'm the collections manager for the Mike Kelly Foundation. This is one goes to Christy. I'd like to hear you speak a little more towards this issue of what to keep, particularly dispensing with items in the estate that are of questionable or nil archival value in light of propensity of people to fetishize objects belonging to the great man.
Is this on? Okay.
And also with unfinished work as well, in which the artist's hand is not present
Okay.
to destroy. Like, how do you get rid of this stuff?
Yeah. So I actually think there are two different strategies on both of those bodies. And this is really a great question, your first one, because I'll tell you a story. In Granger, the little house with the Michael Hauser window, when we were going through all of the houses and becoming acquainted, we would open up one of the doors. It was a closet. And of course, in David Whitney style, it was perfectly curated closet. Ken Price cups, sex toys. I was like, okay, well, we know what to do with the Ken Price cups. Like, what are we going to do with the sex toys? And so it was a really big debate about what is this important or critical or how, and so notwithstanding that particular thing.
We got some of those too.
It's something you will come up against. I mean, from alarm clocks to pajamas to, we ended up donating a lot to the Salvation Army because it's anonymous. And you can't fetishize it, So we did it in two phases. The first phase, actually, and again, I don't know if this is legal or right, but we felt it was morally right, which was we invited a lot of the friends to come and take objects that we felt were uncritical to the archive. And we documented what those were, but we did feel like that was something that was an appropriate thing to do from an estate. So that, and then everything else, we really donated anonymously. You can't track it, it doesn't go on eBay, and create some bizarre tertiary market. So that's important. Thanks for asking that. Unfinished works need to be part of the archive. So that's part of the process and the scholarship of the artist. And I think that's, like, without a doubt what you do.
And what if they're, like, what I'm referring to specifically are these sort of flats that were being constructed that had not become art yet, but they were manufactured in the studio to become art, but really a rough thing to keep in your archive just due to space considerations.
So Rauschenberg had a lot of materials and stretchers and things ready to become art down in Captiva. And we had a discussion around that and made the decision that we would allow the residents to use this because it was not in the continuum yet. And so just as they were able to use his equipment, they would be able to use his materials. So we felt that was important. I will say, I think managing an artist estate, you have to define a set of values, and I call them guiding values for the artist estate. It helps release you from this, I knew him, and this is what he would do. Because you have to create guiding principles for the estate that can transcend ownership, individual ownership, which can get very personal and wonky and bizarre. So the guiding values for Rauschenberg were very much about collaboration, and materials reuse. And so our fair use policy was based on that. And we came out in that discussion because of those values. So it may be worth, that was our outcome, but also considering the values of Mike Kelly.
Thank you both for your wonderful presentation. Mark, you mentioned Dieter Roth and not being accepted by the American market. I feel as a conservator that there is a certain spell on certain artists, and the reality is quite different, because I think, for instance, Dieter Roth's works are very stable. And I think it's really a matter of explaining to the collectors that there are ways to maintain these works, and it's not about this, this falls apart, because it does not. It's a very interesting process that you can witness as a collector, and if I often feel that the role of the conservator is not only to conserve and to fix things, but also to create an understanding of the physical matter of the artwork, and to reassure the collector that it is okay, and it's just building trust between the artwork, between the artwork and the collector and the artist. And it's no, you don't, they are not tools or treatments to do this, but it's just to explain to them what is really happening, and they should not worry, and there are ways to maintain the work. And so I think our role is also to help collectors to acquire works that are maybe less stable, but they're much more interesting than works that are very stable.
I mean, we have done that with you in several instances, right, where we bring you in when something is maybe problematic, and you give your opinion on how that's going to develop over time. And for crucial collectors or institutions, that's a very important part of the sales process. And but I think the non-success commercially of Dieter Roth is only partially that. I think it's not. I mean, I wish it was only the conservation issue. And you know, we take the position, it is an incredible artist of incredible importance, and you just need to insist and show and insist and bring in new scholars, and that's what we can do. And it's waves, and it comes back. When you look at what was really in the canon of the institutions and collections 20 or 30 years ago, it's very different than what it is today. So it will come back, because it's very, very important work. But it is today incredibly difficult.
Hi, this question is for Christy, and it regards transition. And I want to parse it into two, because you refer to we going through the closets, and I wonder if that we was a structure that was set prior to David's death. It sounds like there were no direct heirs, and therefore some of the work that may have been left for a family member to go through closets and clothes and was left to you and the team that I assume was in place, it sounds. So if
No, it wasn't in place.
and the other is if there was no team, or it was a team, or it was not in
I do
place.
want to say what's interesting is David Whitney and Philip Johnson left no instructions. They left two instructions. I'm sorry. One was no doormats. They did not want doormats, and the other was no wall labels. So that's all we had, which is very telling about the minimalist nature of those men. And you know, they did not want that place set up as if they had just left. You know, that was not what was intended. And so there was no structure. It was really about sort of inventorying what needed to happen and thinking about what was for the National Trust. There's a whole other layer of bureaucracy. But I think there's sort of like, you know, what's the right thing to do, and what's the strategic thing to do, and then, you know, what's the right. So you have to sort of consider it on a number of different levels. And it may be easy to go through it with a team, but there was no sort of set bureaucracy, and definitely none defined by David and Philip.
But the house already belonged to the National Trust.
It did. It did.
So
But it had for a decade, so they could have very easily done that.
Okay, I see. So the other question relates to that, where in cases there is no oversight of, like, the National Trust, and it's a family, where a lot of the decisions regarding to the last question of what you keep happen alongside mourning. So there is a process where one is saying goodbye to a loved one, while at the same trying to objectively think about what needs to stay. So I wanted to ask if you could speak just to that, and if there's a, of course there's a difference, but how would you approach it if it's a family specific exercise?
So Rauschenberg was the opposite. So, you had 3 trustees who were stewarding the estate, and then you had a foundation which had a board. And those 3 trustees were very close to Bob. One was the lover, one was the accountant manager, and the other was the printmaker. And you can speak to this also. I mean, I see this a lot now. There's so much emotion after the death of an artist. It's practically impossible to make strategic decisions. They're too emotional. And it goes back to this idea that if you can elongate that timeline in order to accommodate for that grief, that's one thing. And the second is creating this system of values that you can begin to reference. You can actually start to make decisions that feel comforting versus mechanical or material or market-based. So if you're saying things like, does this enhance the idea of risk-taking or collaboration, or will it enhance the legacy? You can make different decisions, and it takes it out of, but that's the thing that Bob gave me on my anniversary. It's not that discussion. It's you're referencing some criteria, and that's saved me, and it's saved our teams time, heartache, and a lot of navigation. You may speak to that, the emotions of the family and.
Well, definitely take time, right? I mean, if that's possible, that's essential.
Yeah.
And then whatever, after a year, 2 years, then take these decisions.
Yeah, I think the time is really important. You just allow yourself the time.
My question is to Marc, and it's about Jack Whitten, for example. And so he was with your gallery for a year, and then he passed away. And so how did you handle that? I mean, have you stopped all sales of his work? Or you, I guess you're reevaluating how you're going to deal with his work, I presume. And you set it up like you told us earlier, the various teams. But is it more difficult because you only knew him a year?
Well, in many instances, we didn't know the artist, right? So I guess we are lucky that we were able to know him. But we don't have a definite answer. I mean, we had so far one meeting with the family, and we stated that we would love to represent the estate. We hope it's the case. And definitely we stop all sales of works immediately. That's a given. And we allow the family to take a breath, to mourn, to then take the decisions they want to take, and hopefully with us, and then we take the next steps. But it's not, nothing is set in stone, nothing is laid out strategically. We strongly believe in the work. We unfortunately think that Jack only experienced a very small portion of his success, way too short, and that is going to continue, that success, and we hope we will be part of that.
Hi, my name is Frank Avila Goldman. I'm from the Liechtenstein estate, and I actually have a question for you, Christy. I was attracted to the thinking outside the box reference to the eyebrow bridge and designating it as art. And I was wondering, even though, I would acknowledge that this is maybe a bit granular and this was a long time ago, but I wondered what, if any, of the pitfalls for that kind of reclassification or that designation would be, and how that maybe pertains to insurance coverage for public use. Because I think that's really fascinating to try to think about ways outside to retain an artist's structure, but also make it available to the larger audience, but not modify it. And I wondered, was it just as easy as reclassifying it for art, or what was involved in
this
that?
case it was, and because most insurance policies, both in that condition and when we did Captiva for Rauschenberg, it's a blanket policy, so it doesn't devalue if it was a movable object, it would not have devalued it by reclassifying it. So I would just call it, whenever you're going to open something to the public, so let's imagine you're thinking about your artist studio or a single artist museum in a home, you need to be thinking about like the stairwell. I know the Judd family, the Judd Rayner, they were thought about, Don liked the stairwell this way, and they spent an enormous amount of money, an amount of money to ensure that it was kept that way versus fire code. So you really have to negotiate what that is so that you can keep it, but yet you have to figure out, like, that's a legal compliance versus an adjustment. So there's sort of levels of bureaucracy. There's, legal levels, and then there's zoning levels and permit levels. It was one reason why, and I offer this to you all as a tidbit, piloting is a way safer thing to do than just to go straight into the conversion of a facility for an artist. We piloted the residency, and therefore we didn't have to go through the same ADA pathway zoning, and there's all sorts of bizarre, complicated, and expensive regulatory things that need to happen. But we rolled into it like, if Bob was having friends over, which he did, what would happen? Let's pilot a residency. And then we just worked on it over time. And by being able to provide faith by fact, so this worked. We invited Chuck Close down so that he could show us, like, how did it work with a wheelchair? And by being able to show that it worked well, we did not have to make the investment that we did at the Glass House. So there's sort of layers of bureaucracy. And the insurance ended up being, because it's a blanket, it didn't end up being specific.
And if you're a nonprofit like Artists Endowed Foundation, there's no IRS kind of oversight for that designation? It really, you as the entity holder can change that yourself?
That's too specific, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the IRS, although, just so all of you know, when we talked about an artist making decisions on their own, it's very different than a foundation and the regulations around being able to make those decisions. And in that case, the IRS, the Attorney General, and a number of different regulatory bodies, evaluate
Yeah,
things,
makes
but they
sense.
would not have evaluated like the reclassification of something.
Got it. Thank you.
I had more of a comment to one of the earlier questions. Beth Noonan, conservator in private practice. And I just wanted to offer as a conservator the importance of the estate and its ability to maintain a materials archive. So you kind of talked about the stuff that is could have been art or was about to be art, and maybe considering maintaining samples and an inventory of that material before using it or dispersing it in some other way.
Yeah. Oh, I agree.
Hello, I'm Susan Anderson, archivist to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and I just wanted to follow up on a question that was asked to Christy about decisions made of what to keep and what to throw away. And I'd like to respectfully offer that archivists could be very able and interested collaborators in this process, that as we try to make professional decisions, objective decisions during a transition process, this is what we do every day on behalf of our institutions and also with the donors that we work with who donate artist archives to settings like mine. And, this is especially important as we consider context and intent and making sure that adequate documentation is in place for future generations as they assign meaning to each artist as we go forward.
I have a great example of that. We're about to donate Elliot Noyes' archive to Harvard, and we're actually trying to forge a partnership between Harvard, Graduate School of Design, and Business School, because the legacy is about CEOs and designers working together. The Harvard librarian and archivists are going to come down with us to look at both the paper archive, what you would traditionally consider as an archive, and all sorts of stuff like family artwork and objects that are throughout the house. And so that the fence around what that is will be defined by that discussion before we go into let's say, a different moment where, it's the odd objects. So that's an example of what you're saying, and I agree with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'd also like to give a shout out to your colleague at the Rauschenberg Foundation, Francine Snyder.
Who is one of the best archivists around. She's, I don't know if she's here, but you should all know her because not only is she an archivist with an open mind. When we first hired Francine, when I was at the foundation, we really had a discussion about Rauschenberg, and we talked about the values. As a collaborator, could we also look at assistance or collaboration with other artists' archives? Because that was central to who Rauschenberg was, and she was the perfect person for that.
Yeah, that we are also very happy partners in open access, so very glad to hear of your advocacy and friendship. Thank you.
Yeah.
My question is something that I've been wondering about, and I'm sure others wonder about too. Could someone define the difference between an estate and a foundation, and why would an artist choose one over the other?
I got it. You want to take it? I got it. It's the Christy song and dance. I'm so sorry. Peter, you spoke about this a little bit yesterday. An estate is a legal transition moment. So it's a moment where you're taking something from the will of the artist to the distribution to family members, key partners, or to whatever body might be the receptacle for the larger body of work. So that's an estate. An estate largely is a transitional bridge. Now, Peter noted the fact that some people call it an estate just because, it's not a foundation. So that might just be inappropriate use of nomenclature, but it's just a name to say, it's not a transition, it's just owned by the family. A foundation can be a private operating or non-operating foundation, and I won't get into the legal minutia of it, but it's a 501c3, so it's governed as a public charity, and there are regulations in terms of how much money you give away or how many artworks you give away as part of your contribution to the cultural sphere. There should be other options for artists than foundations. Foundations are expensive. They can cost a lot of money, and I would say on average, we calculated what that is, and it's between $120,000 and $500,000, depending on how big. Now, some foundations are multi-million-dollar foundations, but so, in my second year of innovating, I'm actually thinking about what are other options, the use of a financial instrument called a donor-advised fund. Could there be a multi-artist foundation which creates an economies of scale? So right now there are options, nuanced legal options, but there are not a lot of, real options besides existing as an estate where the family manages it, or existing as a nonprofit where there's a lot of reporting and a lot of, legal management. You probably manage estates just from the gallery, right?
I mean, I didn't go into the specifics of the difference between foundations and family collections and estates. And we use estates as a general term for works which are wherever they are, in a foundation or in a family or with a friend or whatever, and we work for that in now and in the future. So it's but of course there are serious implications legally how that is organized. But maybe we need to work on the wording.
Can I add something to that? Sorry, I'm going to talk later, and I'll probably talk about this, Andrea Rosen. Actually, I think it's also interesting, and I might talk about this later, about how you use those bodies differently, because I am, for instance, both the executor of the estate of Felix Gonzalez Torres. I am also the director of the foundation of the president of the foundation of Felix Gonzalez Torres. We have an archive of Felix Gonzalez Torres that is incorporated, and those things serve very different functions because a foundation has very specific rules, that not everything is in the best interest of an artist to place within a foundation. So actually, it's really important to understand the delineation between those and how you can use them best to the artist's intentions individually. And I may talk about that when I speak, but I think there are other options, and I'm glad you're thinking about it creative, Christy, because there's a lot to think about, but so sorry.
And this is great because I think this is something that's needed, this collective model. You know, a number of artists incorporated in the 70s. So they made themselves a corporation. And it's a very tax consequential organizational structure that should be probably unbundled before the demise of the artist, because then you're taxed as a corporation. So you can do it a couple of different ways, which makes it a collective, which I think is great. There are rules, and you don't want to diminish what you can do on behalf of the artist by these rules.
I think it's less about financial and more about what you want to accomplish for the agenda, as Christy's talked about, setting up your agenda, what you want to accomplish, and how you do that within a structure and what the structure is best. So.
Right.
Just a comment, Eleonora Nagy, just a comment to Christy's bridge idea and how inventive it was. Donald Judd did like to spare his income from IRS. And when he built the wall around what is called the block, his residence in Marfa, IRS called him up on the fact that he increased his real estate value. So he went to the hearing, and he actually convinced IRS that the entire system of wall, which is quite substantial what he built, is actually a work of art, because as you saw with the circular concrete piece close to the glass house, he basically convinced them that it really adjusts to the environment there, same way like it did with the circular piece, and it is a work of art. Yeah. So he basically spared himself from IRS, from the taxes, but also he proved that it is a work of art. Yeah. So the lesson is he may not be the only one as an artist who did that. So whenever something becomes an estate or a foundation, this is another thing to look into.
So we're gonna have a coffee break right now, and I just want to thank you